Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are breaking down a truly fascinating 1998 South African constitutional court case. We're going to see exactly how a simple, unpaid water and electricity bill turned into a massive, landmark civil rights dispute. It's a gripping story about transition, the pursuit of equality, and the very real growing pains of a newly unified nation.
So, picture this. Would you pay your utility bill if your neighbors were allowed to just skip theirs? If you knew the town next door wasn't being forced to pay their municipal accounts, would you still feel legally obligated to pay yours? Or would you hold back your cash and protest? Well, that is the exact legal dilemma we're unpacking right now.
Here's our case docket for today. We'll start with the unpaid utility bill, move into a tale of two cities, discuss the flat rate dilemma, examine selective legal enforcement, and finally dive into the court's historic verdict.
Section 1. The Unpaid Utility Bill. A Citizen's Stand. Our story starts off simply enough with a man named Mr. J. Walker. He lived in the wealthy, established suburb of Old Pretoria, and between July 1995 and April 1996, he purposefully withheld exactly 4,753 rands and 84 cents from his utility payments. You kind of have to admire the petty precision of withholding exactly 84 cents, right? The thing is, he fully admitted he owed the money. He just refused to pay it as a protest against the City Council's billing practices, which he felt were violating his constitutional rights. Now, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Walker's stand coincided perfectly with the incredibly chaotic timeline of South Africa's post-apartheid municipal restructuring. Back in late 1994, previously segregated local governments were legally forced together into one. By 1995, the brand new council had to implement a temporary flat rate just to manage the chaos. And by 1996, Walker's protest escalated to the point where the City Council actually took legal action against him.
Moving on to Part 2, A Tale of Two Cities, Merging Contrasts.
So in December 1994, the newly formed City Council of Pretoria was handed a truly monumental task. They had to bring together communities that had been deliberately kept apart by apartheid. It was a massive contrast. On one side, you had Old Pretoria. It was affluent, historically white, with fully metered infrastructure for water and electricity, and it had a deeply rooted culture of paying municipal bills. On the completely opposite side were Atteridgeville and Mamelodi. These were historically disadvantaged black townships. Their infrastructure was largely unmetered or just totally broken, and they had a strong culture of non-payment that was actually born out of political resistance during apartheid. To put this administrative nightmare into perspective, just think about the sheer volume of properties spread across these disparate districts. Old Pretoria had over 200,000 households. Meanwhile, Mamelodi and Atteridgeville combined had just under 40,000. The council was somehow tasked with equalizing services and billing across these profoundly different areas, all without sparking civic unrest. Part 3. The Flat Rate Dilemma. The Impossible Task. The City Council had to figure out how on earth to build tens of thousands of households in Atteridgeville and Mamelodi that completely lacked functioning utility meters. Their solution? A pragmatic, temporary flat rate. They figured this out by measuring the bulk utility supply going into the townships, subtracting whatever the local businesses used, and then just dividing the rest by the number of households. The original plan was to install 38,000 new meters by June 1995, but, as you might guess, massive bureaucratic red tape got in the way. So this flat rate stuck around way longer than intended. And here's the catch. It ended up being notably lower than the metered rate applied over in Old Pretoria. Well, this dual billing system is exactly what led Mr. Walker to cry foul. He claimed this resulted in unfair cross-subsidization. Essentially, his argument was that metered residents in Old Pretoria were footing the bill for the unmetered townships. Because Walker was paying a higher metered rate, he argued this was a direct infringement on his constitutional right to equality. So instead of paying his full bill, he only paid an amount that was equivalent to the lower township flat rate.
Section 4. Selective Legal Enforcement. Who gets sued?
Things really boiled over and went from a standard billing dispute to a full-blown constitutional crisis when the City Council started selectively taking legal action. Unpaid bills were a massive, massive problem everywhere. Old Pretoria was in arrears for an astonishing 229 million rands, Mamelodi for 57.5 million, and Atteridgeville for 12 million. But the council officials secretly adopted a policy of exclusively suing defaulters in Old Pretoria, people like Mr. Walker. Because they feared that suing township residents would provoke riots, they simply left them alone. Because of this, Walker argued that this selective enforcement constituted indirect discrimination. Sure, on the surface, the council's policy just targeted geographic areas, Old Pretoria versus the townships. But Walker correctly pointed out that due to South Africa's history, geography and race were inextricably linked. Therefore, enforcing debt collection based purely on geography effectively and unfairly targeted individuals based on race.
Which brings us to Section 5, the court's historic verdict, balancing the scales.
The case went all the way up to the Constitutional Court, forcing the justices into a really tough spot. They had to balance strict constitutional equality against the harsh practical realities of historical disadvantage. Deputy President Langa delivered the majority ruling. He noted that while the flat rate itself was a crude but practical necessity, the selective legal enforcement was a completely different story. Singling out white defaulters while exempting black defaulters was an invasion of dignity, and the court ruled it constituted unfair discrimination.
But right alongside that majority view, you have this absolutely brilliant dissenting perspective from Justice Sachs. He argued that Walker, who was a historically advantaged citizen living in a wealthy suburb, didn't actually suffer any real prejudice from a policy designed to help the historically disadvantaged. Sachs made the point that correcting past discrimination inevitably means treating groups differently in the present, and doing so doesn't automatically mean the privileged group is being unfairly discriminated against.
So how did it all shake out? It built into a highly nuanced three-step resolution from the court. Step 1, the court found the temporary flat rate was, in fact, a practical necessity. Step 2, they agreed that the selective suing of Old Pretoria residents was unfair indirect discrimination. But Step 3, this is the real kicker, the court ruled that Mr. Walker could not use this discrimination as a legal excuse to simply abscond from his debt.
The court firmly put its foot down on the idea of a self-help culture. They established that allowing disgruntled citizens to simply withhold payments as a protest tactic would lead straight to societal chaos. They declared that taking the law into your own hands by refusing to pay for services you've consumed has absolutely no place in a constitutional democracy. Basically, if Walker had a problem, he should have asked the court for a declaration of rights rather than just skipping out on his water bill. Bottom line, he still had to pay up.
So, bringing it all together, what are the key takeaways from this explainer? First, transitioning a divided nation into a unified one is incredibly complex, both on a practical and a legal level. Second, the dual billing system wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a temporary necessity. Third, whenever the state enforces debt, it must be rational, coherent, and impartial. And finally, citizens absolutely cannot use self-help boycotts to solve their legal grievances. You still have to pay for the services you use.
I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. When rebuilding a society, where exactly is the line? How do we balance correcting the systemic, deeply ingrained injustices of the past with ensuring true, strict equality in the present? It's a massive question, and it's one that courts around the world continue to wrestle with every single day. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the world around you.